Iduna and her apples, how Loki put the gods in danger. In Asgard there was a garden, and in that garden there grew a tree, and on that tree there grew shining apples. Thou knowest, O well-beloved one, that every day that passes makes us older and brings us to that day when we will be bent and feeble, gray-headed and weak-eyed. But these shining apples that grew in Asgard, they who ate of them every day never grew a day older, for the eating of the apples kept old age away. Iduna, the goddess, tended the tree on which the shining apples grew. None would grow on the tree unless she was there to tend it. No one but Iduna might pluck the shining apples. Each morning she plucked them and left them in her basket, and every day the gods and goddesses came to her garden, that they might eat the shining apples and so stay young forever. Iduna never went from her garden. All day and every day she stayed in the garden or in her golden house beside it, and all day and every day she listened to Bragi, her husband. He told a story that never had an end. But a time came when Iduna and her apples were lost. They were lost to Asgard, and the gods and goddesses felt old age approach them. How all that happened shall be told thee, O well-beloved. Odin, the father of the gods, often went into the land of men to watch over their doings. Once he took Loki with him. Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil. For a long time they went traveling through the world of men. At last they came near Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. It was a bleak and empty region. There were no growing things there, not even trees with berries. There were no birds, there were no animals. As Odin, the father of the gods, and Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil, went through this region, hunger came upon them. But in all the land around, they saw nothing they could eat. Loki, running here and running there, came at last upon a herd of wild cattle. Creeping up on them, he caught hold of a young bull and killed him. Then he cut up the flesh into strips of meat. He lighted a fire and put the meat on spits to roast. While the meat was being cooked, Odin, the father of the gods, a little way off, sat thinking on the things that he had seen in the world of men. Loki made himself busy putting more and more logs on the fire. At last he called to Odin, and the father of the gods came and sat down near the fire to eat the meal. But when the meat was taken off the cooking spits, and when Odin went to cut it, he found that it was still raw. He smiled at Loki for thinking the meat was cooked, and Loki, troubled that he had made a mistake, put the meat back on and put more logs under the fire. Again Loki took the meat off the cooking spit and called Odin for the meal. Odin, when he saw the meal that Loki brought him, found that it was as raw as if it had never been put on the fire. "Is this a trick of yours, Loki?" he said. Loki was very angry at the meat being uncooked, so angry that Odin saw he was playing no tricks this time. In his hunger, he raged at the meat and he raged at the fire. Again he put the meat on the cooking spits and put more logs on the fire. Every hour he would take up the meat, sure that it would be cooked, and every time he took it off, Odin would find that the meat was as raw as the first time they took it off the fire. Now Odin knew the meat must be under some enchantment by the giants. He stood up and went on his way, hungry but strong. Loki, however, would not leave the meat that he had put back on the fire. He would make it be cooked, he declared. He would not leave that place hungry. The dawn came, and he took up the meat again. And as he was lifting it off the fire, he heard a whir of wings above his head. Looking up, he saw a mighty eagle, the largest eagle that ever appeared in the sky. The eagle circled round and round and came above Loki's head. "Canst thou not cook thy food?" the eagle screamed to him. "I cannot cook it," said Loki. "I will cook it for thee, if thou wilt give me a share," said the eagle. "Come then, cook it for me," said Loki. The eagle circled around until he was above the fire. Then, flapping his great wings over it, he made the fire blaze and blaze. A heat that Loki had never felt before came from the burning logs. In a minute he saw the meat from the spit and found it well cooked. my share, give me my share," the eagle screamed. He flew down and, seizing a large piece of meat, instantly devoured it. He seized another piece. Piece after piece he devoured, until it looked as if Loki would be left with no meat for his meal. As the eagle seized the last piece, Loki became angry. Taking up the spit on which the meat had been cooked, he struck at the eagle. There was a clang, as if he had struck metal. The wood of the spit did not come away. It stuck to the breast of the eagle. But Loki did not let go his hold on the spit. Suddenly the eagle rose up in the air. Loki, who held on to the spit that was fastened to the eagle's breast, was drawn up with him. Before he knew what had happened, Loki was miles and miles up in the air, and the eagle was flying with him towards Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. And the eagle was screaming out, "Loki, friend Loki, I have thee at last. It was thou who didst cheat my brother of his reward for building the wall around Asgard. But Loki, I have thee at last. Know now that Thiassi the giant has captured thee, O Loki, most cunning of the dwellers in Asgard." Thus the eagle screamed as he went flying with Loki towards Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. They passed over the river that divides Jotunheim from Midgard, the world of men. And now Loki saw a terrible place beneath him, a land of ice and rock. Great mountains were there. They were lighted by neither sun nor moon, but by columns of fire thrown up now and again through cracks in the earth or out of the peaks of mountains. Over a great iceberg the eagle hovered. Suddenly he shook the spit from his breast, and Loki fell down on the ice. The eagle screamed out to him, "Thou art in my power at last, O thou most cunning of the dwellers in Asgard." The eagle left Loki there, and flew off within a crack in the mountains. Miserable indeed was Loki upon that iceberg. The cold was deadly. He could not die there, for he was one of the dwellers in Asgard, and death might not come to him that way. He might not die, but he felt bound to that iceberg with chains of cold. After a day his captor came to him, not as an eagle this time, but in his own form, as Thiassi the giant. "Wouldst thou leave thine iceberg, Loki?" he said, "and return to thy pleasant place in Asgard? Thou dost delight in Asgard, although only by 1/2 dost thou belong to the gods. Thy father, Loki, was the wind giant." "Oh, that I might leave this iceberg," Loki said, with tears freezing on his face. Thou mayest leave it when thou showest thyself ready to pay thy ransom to me, said Thiassi. Thou wilt have to get me the shining apples that Iduna keeps in her basket. I cannot get Iduna's apples for thee, Thiassi, said Loki. Then stay upon the iceberg, said Thiassi the giant. He went away, and he left Loki there, with the terrible winds buffeting him like the blows of a hammer. When Thiassi came again and spoke to him about his ransom, Loki said, There is no way of getting the shining apples from Iduna. There must be some way, O cunning Loki, said the giant. Iduna, though she guards well the shining apples, is simple-minded, said Loki. It may be that I'll be able to get her to go outside the walls of Asgard. If she goes, she will bring her shining apples with her, for she never leaves them go out of her hand, except when she gives them to the gods and goddesses to eat. Make it so she will go beyond the wall of Asgard, said the giant. If she goes outside the wall, I shall get the apples from her. Swear by the world tree that thou wilt lure Iduna beyond the wall of Asgard. Swear it, Loki, and I shall let thee go. I swear it by Yggdrasil, the world tree, that I will lure Iduna beyond the walls of Asgard, if thou wilt take me off this iceberg, said Loki. Then Thiassi changed himself into a mighty eagle, and taking Loki in his talons, he flew with him over the stream that divides Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, from Midgard, the world of men. He left Loki on the ground of Midgard, and Loki then went on his way to Asgard. Now Odin had already returned, and he had told the dwellers in Asgard of Loki's attempt to cook the enchanted meat. All laughed to think that Loki had been left hungry for all of his cunning. Then, when he came into Asgard looking so famished, they thought it was because Loki had had nothing to eat, and they laughed at him more and more. But they brought him into the feast hall, and they gave him the best of food with wine out of Odin's wine cup. When the feast was over, the dwellers in Asgard went to Iduna's garden, as was their wont. There sat Iduna in the golden house that opened on her garden. Had she been in the world of men, everyone who saw her would have remembered their own innocence, seeing one who was so fair and good. She had eyes blue as the blue sky, and she smiled as if she were remembering lovely things that she had seen or heard. The basket of shining apples was beside her. To each god and goddess Iduna gave a shining apple. Each one ate the apple given, rejoicing to think they would never become a day older. Then Odin, the father of the gods, said the runes that were always said in praise of Iduna, and the dwellers in Asgard went out of Iduna's garden, each one going to his or her own shining house. All went except Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil. Loki sat in the garden, watching fair and simple Iduna. After a while she spoke to him and said, Why dost thou still stay here, wise Loki? To look well on thine apples, said Loki. I am wondering if the apples I saw yesterday are really as shining as the apples that are in thy basket. There are no apples in the world as shining as mine, said Iduna. The apples I saw were more shining, said Loki. Aye, and they smelled better, Iduna. Iduna was troubled by what Loki said, whom she deemed so wise. Her eyes filled with tears that there might be more shining apples in the world than hers. "O Loki, it cannot be. No apples are more shining, and none smell as sweet as the apples I pluck off my tree in my garden." "Go then and see," said Loki. "Just outside Asgard is the tree that has the apples I saw. Thou, Iduna, dost never leave thy garden, so thou dost not know what grows in the world. Go just outside of Asgard and see." "I will go, Loki," said Iduna, the fair and simple. Iduna went outside the wall of Asgard. She went to the place Loki had told her that the apples grew in. But as she looked this way and that, Iduna heard a whir of wings above her. Looking up, she saw a mighty eagle, the largest eagle that had ever appeared in the sky. She drew back towards the gates of Asgard. Then the great eagle swooped down. Iduna felt herself lifted up, and then she was being carried away from Asgard, away, far away, over Midgard where men lived, still farther away towards the rocks and snows of Jotunheim, across the river that flows beyond the world of men in the realm of giants. Iduna was born. Then the eagle flew into a cleft in the mountain, and Iduna was left in a cavernous hall, lighted up by columns of fire that burst up from the earth. The eagle loosened his grip on Iduna, and she sank down on the ground of the cavern. The wings and the feathers fell from him, and she saw her captor was a terrible giant. "Oh, why have you carried me from Asgard and brought me to this place?" Iduna cried. "That I might eat of your shining apples, Iduna," said Thiassi the giant. "That will never be, for I will not give them to you," said Iduna. "Give me the apples to eat, and I shall carry you back to Asgard." "No, no, that cannot be. I have been trusted with the shining apples that I might give them to the gods only." "Then I shall take the apples from you." He took the basket out of her hands and opened it. But when he touched the apples, they shriveled under his hands. He left them in that basket, and he set the basket down, for he knew now that the apples would be no good to him unless Iduna gave them to him with her own hands. "You must stay here until you give me the shining apples," he said to her. Then was poor Iduna frightened. She was frightened of the strange cave, frightened of the fire that kept bursting up out of the earth, and frightened of the terrible giant. But above all, she was frightened to think of the evil that would fall on the dwellers in Asgard if she were not there to give them the shining apples to eat. The giant came to her again, but still Iduna would not give him the shining apples. And there in the cave she stayed, the giant troubling her every day. And she grew more and more fearful as she saw in her dreams the dwellers in Asgard go to her garden. Go there and not being given the shining apples, feel and see a change coming over themselves and over each other. It was as Iduna saw in her dreams. Every day the dwellers in Asgard went to her gardens, Odin and Thor, Hodor and Baldur, Tyr and Heimdall, Vidar and Vali, with Frigga, Freya, Nanna, and Sif. There was no one to pick the apples of the tree, and a change began to come over the gods and goddesses. They no longer walked lightly. Their shoulders became bent. Their eyes no longer were as bright as dewdrops, and when they looked upon one another, they saw the change. Age was coming upon the dwellers of Asgard. They knew that the time would come when Frigga would be gray and old, when Sif's golden hair would fade, when Odin would no longer have his clear wisdom, and when Thor would not have enough strength to raise and fling his thunderbolts. And the dwellers in Asgard were saddened by this knowledge, and it seemed to them that all brightness had gone out of their shining city. Where was Iduna, whose apples would give back youth and strength and beauty to the dwellers in Asgard? The gods searched for her through the world of men. No trace did they find. But now Odin, searching through his wisdom, saw a means to get a knowledge of where Iduna was hidden. He summoned his 2 ravens, Holgun and Monin, his 2 ravens that flew through the earth and through the realm of the giants, and that knew all things that were past and all things that were to come. He summoned Holgun and Monin, and they came, and one sat on his right shoulder, and one sat on his left shoulder, and they told him deep secrets. They told him of Thiassi and his desire for the shining apples that the dwellers in Asgard ate, and of Loki's deception of Iduna, the fair and simple. What Odin learnt from his ravens was told in the council of the gods. Then Thor the strong went to Loki and laid hands upon him. When Loki found himself in the grip of the strong god, he said, "What wouldst thou do with me, O Thor?" "I would hurl thee into a chasm in the ground and strike thee with my thunder," said the strong god. "It was thou who didst bring it about that Iduna went from Asgard." "O Thor," said Loki, "do not crush me with thy thunder. Let me stay in Asgard. I will strive to bring Iduna back." "The judgment of the gods," said Thor, "is that thou, the cunning one, shouldest go to Jotunheim, and by thy craft win Iduna back from the giants. Go, or else I shall hurl thee into a chasm and crush thee with my thunder." "I will go," said Loki. From Frigga, the wife of Odin, Loki borrowed the dress of falcon feathers that she owned. He clad himself in it and flew to Jotunheim in the form of a falcon. He searched through Jotunheim, and he found Thiassi's daughter, Skadi. He flew before Skadi, and he let the giant maid catch him and hold him as a pet. One day the giant maid carried him into the cave where Iduna, the fair and simple, was held. When Loki saw Iduna there, he knew that part of his quest was completed. Now he had to get Iduna out of Jotunheim and away to Asgard. He stayed no more with the giant maid, but flew up into the high rocks of the cave. Skadi wept for the flight of her pet, but she ceased to search and call and finally went away from the cave. Then Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil, flew to where Iduna was sitting and spoke to her. Iduna, when she knew that one of the dwellers in Asgard was near, wept with joy. Loki told her what she was to do. By the power of a spell that was given him, he was able to change her into the form of a sparrow. But before she did this, she took the shining apples out of her basket and flung them into places where the giant would never find them. Skadi, coming back to the cave, saw the falcon fly out with the sparrow beside him. She cried out to her father, and the giant knew the falcon was Loki and the sparrow was Iduna. He changed himself into the form of a mighty eagle. By this time, sparrow and falcon were out of sight, but Thiassi, knowing that he could make better flight than they, flew towards Asgard. Soon he saw them. They flew with all the power they had, but the great wings of the eagle brought him nearer and nearer to them. The dwellers in Asgard, standing on the wall, saw the falcon and the sparrow, with the great eagle pursuing them. They knew who they were, Loki and Iduna with Thiassi in pursuit. As they watched the eagle flying nearer and nearer, the dwellers in Asgard were fearful that the falcon and the sparrow would be caught, and that Iduna would be taken again by Thiassi. They lighted great fires upon the wall, knowing that Loki would find a way through the fires, bringing Iduna with him, but that Thiassi would not find a way. The falcon and the sparrow flew towards the fires. Loki went up between the flames and brought Iduna with him. Then Thiassi, coming up to the fires and finding no way through, beat his wings against the flames. He fell down from the wall, and the death that came to him afterwards was laid to Loki's blame. Thus Iduna was brought back to Asgard. Once again she sat in the golden house that opened to her garden. Once again she plucked the shining apples off the tree she tended, and once again she gave them to the dwellers in Asgard. And the dwellers in Asgard walked lightly again, and brightness came into their eyes and into their cheeks. Age no more approached them. Youth came back. Light and joy were again in Asgard.